Ivory Coast's political red card, democracy on the brink or just the beginning. Welcome to the Bold African Voice, BAV, where we tell Africa's stories and hold Africa's leaders accountable. I'm Abdul Karim Kargbo, born and raised in Africa. Today, we turn our spotlight to Côte d'Ivoire, a country at the center of West Africa's democratic debate. Is the disqualification of Tidjane Thiam a legal technicality or a dangerous slide into exclusionary politics? Join us as we unpack the facts, analyze the regional impact, and ask the hard questions, because democracy deserves more than silence. A Fractured Road to October 2025. The 2025 presidential election in Côte d'Ivoire, once expected to be a significant step forward for West African democratic consolidation, is now clouded by legal entanglements, selective exclusions, and rising political uncertainty. At the center of this storm is the disqualification of opposition frontrunner Tidjane Thiam, a globally renowned banker turned politician whose presidential ambitions have been derailed by a court ruling that stripped him of his Ivorian nationality on the grounds of a decades-old dual citizenship law. This ruling has revived memories of the divisive Ivoirité debates of the 1990s and early 2000s, raising uncomfortable questions about whether Ivory Coast is truly moving forward democratically or quietly backsliding into the shadows of exclusionary politics. The case of Tidjane Thiam, technocrat turned political outsider. Tidjane Thiam, a former CEO of Credit Suisse and Prudential, returned to Ivory Coast in 2022 with a compelling resume and lineage that traces directly to the country's founding father, Félix Houphouët-Boigny. His assumption of leadership in the Democratic Party of Côte d'Ivoire, PDCI, following the death of Henri Konan Bédié in 2023, positioned him as the most formidable opposition candidate heading into the 2025 election. However, on 22nd April 2024, an Ivorian court ruled that Thiam had automatically lost his Ivorian citizenship when he acquired French nationality in the 1980s, a legal interpretation based on a rarely enforced 1961 nationality law. Although Thiam renounced his French citizenship in February 2024, the court declared the move was too late to allow him to qualify as a candidate or even register as a voter. As per Ivorian electoral law, candidates must be on the electoral roll, which was finalized before his citizenship restoration. This decision mirrors previous tactics that weaponized nationality to exclude rivals. Ouattara himself was once barred from running due to claims of foreign ancestry. Ironically, his government now faces criticism for leveraging similar technicalities to neutralize challengers. Democracy in retreat, the legal purge of political opposition. Thiam's disqualification is not isolated. Three other influential opposition figures, Laurent Gbagbo, Guillaume Soro, and Charles Blé Goudet, have already been ruled out due to past convictions, further shrinking the field of credible challengers. In a functioning democracy, disqualifications of leading opposition figures raise serious red flags. According to the 2023 Afrobarometer survey, 68% of Ivorians said they wanted to see political change through the ballot box. Yet the judiciary's selective interpretation of laws risks entrenching power within the ruling rally of Houphouetists for Democracy and Peace, RHDP. The exclusion of credible contenders threatens to turn the 2025 vote into a formality rather than a genuine contest. Comparative analysis, West Africa's authoritarian creep versus democratic resilience. The developments in Côte d'Ivoire are emblematic of broader democratic regression across Francophone West Africa. In Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, elected governments have been toppled by military juntas, often cheered on by youth disillusioned with entrenched elites and corrupt institutions. These transitions are justified in populist rhetoric as necessary resets, but they often culminate in authoritarian entrenchment. However, signs of hope also emerged in 2023 and early 2024. Liberia's peaceful transition following Joseph Boakai's win over incumbent George Weah and Senegal's historic youth-led election that swept opposition candidate Bassirou Diomaye Faye to power provide a contrasting model. These nations demonstrated that democratic renewal is possible when electoral processes remain open, fair, and inclusive. By contrast, Ivory Coast risks isolation from this wave of progress. It was once seen as a model for post-conflict recovery and economic revitalization, with growth rates averaging over 6% annually under Ouattara. Yet political exclusion now threatens the legitimacy of the institutions that helped stabilize the country after its civil wars. The legal and institutional dilemma, law as a tool of exclusion. The court's decision against Thiam highlights an ongoing crisis of institutional neutrality in Ivory Coast. While the ruling may be technically legal under the 1961 law, the timing and selectivity raise suspicions of political interference. As reported by RFI, Radio France Internationale, and BBC Africa, Thiam's legal team argues that he held French nationality from birth, thus falling outside the scope of the clause that prohibits dual citizens from running. If his claim is valid, the judiciary's rigid application of the law could be perceived as a deliberate obstruction, especially since the ruling cannot be appealed under current electoral jurisprudence. Moreover, the potential rulings scheduled this week, questioning Thiam's ability to even lead the PDCI as a non-citizen, could further strain political stability. These judicial interventions recall the days when Ivoirité laws were used to delegitimize candidates based on parentage, dividing the nation along ethnic and regional lines. Economic implications, the cost of political instability. Ivory Coast is not just a political heavyweight, it is the economic engine of the West African Economic and Monetary Union, WMU. Its stability underpins regional financial flows, trade, and infrastructure integration. Political unrest or perceptions of democratic illegitimacy could damage investor confidence, threaten aid partnerships, and prompt domestic unrest, especially among youth. Already, civil society organizations are voicing concern. According to Amnesty International, the exclusion of key political actors undermines the credibility of the electoral process and risks provoking social unrest. With over 70% of Ivorians under 35, many already disconnected from the political elite, the exclusion of a high-profile candidate like Thiam could energize anti-system movements or even foment unrest, reminiscent of the 2010-2011 post-election crisis, which claimed over 3,000 lives. Pan-African repercussions, a cautionary tale. The Thiam case is drawing attention across the continent, particularly among reformists advocating for democratic deepening in countries like Togo, Cameroon, and Chad, where long-standing leaders have clung to power through constitutional manipulation or legal acrobatics. In contrast, Ghana's constitutional term limits, Kenya's judiciary-led electoral reforms, and Zambia's 2021 peaceful opposition victory under Hakainde Hichilema offer better institutional models. The regional divergence signals a growing divide between countries that embrace democratic reforms and those that use technicalities to entrench incumbents. What next? Possible scenarios. Ahead. With the election months away, there is still room for political compromise. President Ouattara, whose legacy as a stabilizer is at stake, may be inclined to engineer a consensus-based solution, perhaps a legislative reform or a presidential pardon mechanism that reopens the door to Thiam and other excluded candidates. Doing so could also bolster Côte d'Ivoire's international image and reduce the risk of boycotts or civil protests. Meanwhile, the PDCI and other opposition factions are rallying behind calls for a national dialogue on inclusive democracy. Yet the risk remains that the ruling RHDP may press ahead with a choreographed electoral process, hoping that economic growth and elite backing will compensate for political disillusionment. Strategic recommendations: rebuilding trust in the electoral process. If Côte d'Ivoire is to maintain its image as a beacon of economic growth in West Africa, it must urgently address the perception of democratic backsliding. The controversy surrounding Tidjane Thiam's disqualification has not only disrupted the electoral calendar, but has also damaged trust in the judiciary's independence and the broader democratic framework. To begin rebuilding credibility, civil society groups, the private sector, and regional actors must push for a series of urgent reforms. 1. Electoral law reform. The Ivorian legislature should urgently review the nationality clause in the Electoral Code and clarify the eligibility requirements for dual citizens. As it stands, the ambiguity and selectivity in enforcement open the door for judicial manipulation. Such a revision could prevent similar crises in future elections. 2. Constitutional safeguards against exclusionary politics. Ivory Coast must revisit the spirit of the 2016 Constitution, which aimed to end the politics of identity exclusion. A binding constitutional interpretation mechanism or electoral dispute resolution chamber could help limit arbitrary decisions by lower courts. 3. Empowering an independent electoral commission, CEI. For the October 2025 elections to be credible, the CEI must act with full transparency and independence. In past electoral cycles, the Commission has been accused of bias, particularly in candidate validation processes. Reforms must ensure representation of opposition voices and civil society in electoral oversight bodies. 4. International and ECOWAS mediation. The Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, under whose umbrella Côte d'Ivoire remains a political heavyweight, should proactively mediate to prevent the current crisis from escalating. Early diplomatic intervention could facilitate a political compromise that restores faith in the electoral process. 5. Presidential statesmanship from Ouattara. As one of the continent's most experienced leaders, President Alassane Ouattara has a historic opportunity to end his tenure on a democratic high note. Whether he runs for a fourth term or not, his legacy now depends on whether he facilitates a free, fair, and inclusive election, one that includes all legitimate opposition figures. Civil society and youth voices. The tipping point? Côte d'Ivoire's youth, a generation born amid or just after the Civil War, are watching this saga closely. Unlike their parents' generation, today's youth are increasingly digital savvy, globally connected, and less tolerant of opaque political processes. On platforms like Twitter, X, and Facebook, hashtags like Justice for Thiam and Jock Democracy NCI have gained traction. Influential Ivorian journalists, bloggers, and musicians have begun voicing subtle yet pointed criticisms of the disqualification, framing it as a betrayal of democratic values. Several youth-led organizations, including Citoyens pour la République and Jeunesse Unie pour la Démocratie, are mobilizing peaceful marches and panel discussions across Abidjan and Bouaké to discuss electoral transparency and constitutional rights. Though these gatherings remain peaceful, the memory of violent protests after the disputed 2020 election remains fresh, and observers fear a tipping point if exclusion persists. Meanwhile, respected civil society platforms such as RAIDACH, Réseau des acteurs ivoiriens des droits de l'homme, and LIDHO, Ligue ivoirienne des droits de l'homme, have issued joint communiqués demanding the reinstatement of disqualified candidates and warning of the implications of a one-horse race in 2025. International reactions, cautious concern, and strategic silence. So far, the international community, including France, the United Nations, and the African Union, has responded with diplomatic restraint, perhaps not wishing to disrupt a fragile stability in one of West Africa's few remaining growth hubs. However, Chatham House analyst Paul Melly, whose report triggered renewed attention on this issue, warns that prolonged silence could be interpreted as tacit approval of democratic backsliding. There is a fine line between non-interference and complicity, Melly writes, urging multilateral actors to balance respect for sovereignty with the responsibility to uphold democratic norms. Already, Western investment houses and international financial institutions are quietly monitoring the political risk premium. Ivory Coast's Eurobond yields, while stable for now, could rise if protests escalate or international confidence in the electoral process erodes. Such developments could threaten Côte d'Ivoire's 2025-2030 National Development Plan, PND, which aims to position the country as an emerging economy. Regional implications, the Ivoirité 2.0 syndrome. The return of nationality-based disqualification in Côte d'Ivoire is also stirring discomfort among other Francophone African nations, where similar exclusionary tools have been used to control political competition. In Chad, Togo, and Cameroon, ruling elites have clung to power by using constitutional loopholes, age limits, and selective legal applications to sideline opposition. In contrast, Benin, once a bastion of multi-party democracy, has seen recent reversals due to the passage of restrictive electoral codes. The Thiam case may therefore signal a broader regional pattern, the use of technocratic legality to achieve political exclusion, a shift from military coups to legal coup. What makes the Ivorian situation especially potent is that Thiam represents not just a political threat, but a symbolic challenge to the entrenched elite. A technocrat with international acclaim, local lineage, and a message of competence over populism. His removal signals that even moderate, non-radical opposition can be sidelined if it threatens the political status quo. Economic fallout, risk to investment climate and development plans. The exclusion of Tidjane Thiam, a former CEO of Prudential and Credit Suisse, sends a chilling message not only to political rivals, but also to international investors and development partners. Thiam's global stature was widely seen as a bridge between Ivory Coast's local potential and global capital markets. His candidacy had generated optimism among investors looking for political stability combined with economic prudence. Now, that optimism is beginning to wane. According to Bloomberg and Africa Report, investor confidence in Ivorian financial instruments remains relatively stable for now, but analysts warn of medium-term volatility if political exclusionism translates into civil unrest or violent contestation post-election. The Ivory Coast Eurobond, maturing in 2032, saw a minor yield increase following the April 22nd ruling, a small but symbolic movement that indicates growing concern. The 2021-2025 National Development Plan, PND, which targets a structural transformation of the economy and aims to reach upper middle income status by 2030, may now face delays. Political uncertainty risks stalling flagship infrastructure projects, reducing foreign direct investment, FDI, and complicating financing from international partners such as the IMF, World Bank, and African Development Bank, AFDB. Moreover, the cocoa sector, which contributes nearly 40% of export revenues, is already under pressure due to climate shocks and global price volatility. Political instability could further disrupt the regulatory framework governing this critical industry. If rural areas perceive the political system as rigged or exclusionary, the government could face mounting discontent from farmer cooperatives and trade unions, especially in the cocoa-rich western and central regions. What next for Tidjane Thiam? Despite the legal setbacks, Tidjane Thiam remains a formidable political figure, and many observers believe his political capital has grown rather than diminished. The very act of disqualification has increased his visibility, drawing attention to the systemic limitations of Ivorian democracy and casting him as a symbol of unjust exclusion. There are several potential pathways still open for Thiam. 1. Political bargaining and compromise. With months left before the October polls, a negotiated political solution could be brokered to allow his participation, especially if President Ouattara decides not to seek a fourth term and desires a credible, peaceful transition. 2. Legal reform via parliamentary channels. PDCI members and allies in Parliament could push for an emergency amendment or reinterpretation of the nationality clause, though this would require unprecedented political will and cross-party support. 3. Coalition building. Thiam may galvanize support among excluded figures like Gbagbo, Soro, and Blé Goudet to build a unified opposition front, not necessarily for 2025, but for long-term democratic reform. 4. Transitional role as a statesman. Should all legal avenues close, Thiam could assume a strategic role as a technocratic influencer or mediator, engaging international stakeholders, funding civil society initiatives, or laying groundwork for a future electoral bid. According to political commentator Serge Yao of Université Alassane Ouattara, Thiam's biggest asset is his legitimacy in the eyes of the international community and the Ivorian middle class. If he plays his cards right, this episode might be just the beginning of his political journey. Institutional lessons, strengthening democratic architecture. The saga presents a teachable moment for Ivory Coast and other African democracies. If electoral laws can be deployed or interpreted to exclude candidates after they have already been nominated by a major political party, then democracy becomes contingent on legal technicalities rather than the popular will. To restore public trust and prevent future crises, several institutional reforms are urgently needed. Reform of nationality and candidacy laws. These laws must be modernized, harmonized, and made consistent with global norms to eliminate ambiguity and ensure inclusiveness. As UNDP has noted in its report on electoral governance in West Africa, legal clarity is a cornerstone of credible elections. Judicial independence and oversight. The perception that courts are tools of the executive must be corrected through transparency in judicial appointments, term limits, and independent monitoring bodies. Electoral Commission reform. The CEI must adopt inclusive governance practices, ensure gender and youth representation, and be equipped with early warning systems for political exclusion risks. Civic education campaigns. Mass civic education is needed to help young Ivorians understand their rights and the functioning of their institutions. This is critical in a country where more than half of the voting population is under 35, and many are first-time voters. Continental perspective, a mirror to African democracies. Across Africa, similar legal and constitutional loopholes are being exploited to silence dissent, clinch third or fourth presidential terms, or exclude opposition leaders. From the pre-election disqualification of Ousmane Sonko in Senegal, 2023, to the arrest and silencing of opposition voices in Uganda, the use of state machinery to preempt democratic competition is a growing concern. At the African Union level, silence or delayed response to such maneuvers weakens the continental body's credibility as a custodian of the African Charter on Democracy, Elections and Governance, 2007. If Côte d'Ivoire, a regional heavyweight, follows this path without consequence, it may set a dangerous precedent for Francophone Africa, where democratic institutions are still fragile. Voter response and the pulse of the electorate. Anger, apathy, or activism. As Ivory Coast inches toward the October 2025 elections, the response of the electorate, especially the youth, will be pivotal in determining the tone and legitimacy of the outcome. The controversy surrounding Thiam's exclusion is unfolding in a nation where democratic consciousness is growing, albeit alongside mounting cynicism about the utility of the ballot box. In Abidjan, Yamoussoukro, and Korhogo, anecdotal evidence suggests that citizen frustration is intensifying, particularly among urban youths who had been drawn to Thiam's technocratic vision, his international credibility, and his promise to modernize the Ivorian political system. While many still support President Ouattara for his economic achievements, a growing segment views the system as rigged against change, with elections serving to merely validate the status quo. Youth-led organizations such as Initiative Citoyenne pour la Transparence Electorale and student unions at major universities have issued open letters condemning what they describe as a judicial disenfranchisement of voters. The idea that excluding credible opposition denies the electorate its right to choose from a full spectrum of candidates. At the same time, there are signs of emerging political apathy. Several interviews conducted by VOA Africa and Jeune Afrique show that many citizens, especially in rural areas, believe their votes no longer matter if opposition leaders are preemptively disqualified. This growing indifference is dangerous. A disengaged electorate creates space for authoritarianism to flourish unchallenged. Yet a third current is also emerging: activist resurgence. Pro-democracy movements are planning mass voter education campaigns to galvanize participation despite frustrations. Civil society coalitions are leveraging social media, street theater, music, and school outreach to remind Ivorians that electoral legitimacy depends not only on who runs, but also on how many turn out to vote and how loudly they speak through the ballot. International diplomacy and the role of external actors. As Côte d'Ivoire enters a sensitive political juncture, the role of international actors will be closely scrutinized. Unlike the post-2010 crisis, when the UN, France, and ECOWAS played a direct interventionist role, the current situation calls for measured, strategic diplomacy to uphold democratic norms without destabilizing the country. Several options are on the table. 1. Preventive diplomacy by ECOWAS. The regional bloc has a mandate under its Protocol on Democracy and Good Governance, 2001, to ensure free and fair elections. ECOWAS could deploy a pre-election monitoring mission focused not only on polling logistics, but on candidate eligibility frameworks and political inclusiveness. 2. Quiet diplomacy from France and the EU. Given Thiam's ties to France and European financial circles, French diplomats may be uniquely positioned to broker behind-the-scenes compromises. However, France must proceed delicately to avoid accusations of neo-colonial interference, a sensitive issue in Ivorian politics. 3. Incentive-based diplomacy from multilateral institutions. The World Bank, IMF, and AFDB could link components of financing arrangements to governance benchmarks, including electoral integrity and judicial independence. This form of conditional assistance, already used in Zambia and Malawi, could encourage institutional reforms without being overtly coercive. 4. African Union Good Offices Initiative. The AU's panel of the wise, comprising respected former leaders and jurists, could facilitate dialogue between the Ouattara administration, the judiciary, opposition parties, and civil society. Though rarely invoked, this mechanism offers a Pan-African alternative to foreign pressure, rooted in mutual respect and continental values. Yet the longer the Thiam exclusion stands without mediation, the more likely it is that international silence will be seen as complicity, particularly by younger Ivorian voters who are increasingly attuned to international norms and global narratives of democracy and fairness. Democratic integrity and the shadow of Ivoirité 2.0. Observers have begun referring to the current impasse as a form of Ivoirité 2.0, a sanitized legalistic reincarnation of the divisive doctrine that plagued the country during its darkest political chapters. Unlike the original version, which stoked overt ethnic divisions, today's variant operates through technical disqualification, bureaucratic delays, and opaque judicial rulings. This evolution reflects a broader African trend where exclusion is no longer enforced through violence or coups, but through courtrooms, constitutional reinterpretations, and institutional engineering. As political scientist Dr. Ndeye Fatou Diop of Dakar's WARC Institute puts it, today's electoral manipulations wear suits and carry law books, not guns. In the Ivorian context, this legal exclusionism poses at least three dangers. Normalization of exclusion. If disqualifying candidates becomes a regular part of the electoral process, it creates a chilling effect on future contenders, particularly those from diaspora backgrounds or politically independent profiles. Loss of institutional credibility. Courts, electoral commissions, and the legislature risk losing public trust, becoming seen as appendages of ruling elites rather than guardians of democratic balance. Potential for radicalization. Marginalized groups, especially youths and civil society actors, may resort to non-institutional means of protest, including civil disobedience, online disruption, or even unrest if peaceful political alternatives appear futile. The stakes ahead, from elite maneuvering to national consequences. What happens in Ivory Coast in the coming months will reverberate across the continent. The country's economic power, political influence in ECOWAS, and strategic partnerships with global players mean its democratic health is not a parochial concern, it is a continental bellwether. The decisions made by President Ouattara, the judiciary, and the political elite will either affirm Côte d'Ivoire's commitment to democratic renewal or push it closer to soft authoritarianism wrapped in procedural legality. But the weight of the moment also lies with Ivorian citizens themselves, especially its 18 million registered voters. Whether through protest, participation, advocacy, or apathy, the people will define whether this episode becomes a turning point toward greater accountability or a quiet slide into elite entrenchment. Advisory to African leaders, a moment of reflection and course correction. Côte d'Ivoire's unfolding saga is not merely a domestic political episode, it is a mirror held up to African leadership at large. The continent, rich in human and natural capital, cannot afford to stagnate under a cycle of elite dominance, exclusionary politics, and democratic erosion disguised as legalism. What is happening in Abidjan today could, with slight variation, occur in Bamako, N'Djamena, Yaoundé, or Kinshasa tomorrow. Across Africa, the lesson is clear. Manipulating electoral frameworks and weaponizing legality against opposition figures is a form of political cowardice, not strategy. It may preserve incumbency in the short term, but it erodes legitimacy, destabilizes institutions, and invites disillusionment among young people, the very demographic that must lead Africa's future. African leaders must urgently recalibrate their commitment to constitutionalism, inclusion, and democratic resilience. This means more than just holding elections. It means ensuring genuine multi-party competition, where opposition candidates are not eliminated through judicial semantics or administrative loopholes. Strengthening independent institutions that are free from executive capture, particularly courts, electoral commissions, and ombudsman offices. Supporting transparency in party financing, voter registration processes, and media access, cornerstones of a level electoral playing field. encouraging term limits not just as a constitutional requirement, but as a democratic virtue that renews leadership and builds trust. In the words of former Ghanaian President John Kufuor, Africa does not lack talent. It lacks enabling environments where that talent can flourish through fair competition. Tidjane Thiam's disqualification, regardless of its legal reasoning, has denied Ivorians a full expression of that competition. The role of Pan-African solidarity, from silence to safeguarding democracy. The African Union, AU, ECOWAS, and other regional institutions must recognize that their silence in moments like this amounts to abdication of their mandate. While respecting national sovereignty is vital, so too is upholding democratic norms as enshrined in the African Charter on democracy, elections, and governance. In this regard, the following steps are crucial. 1. Early warning and peer review systems. The AU must move from reactive post-election missions to proactive democracy audits, especially in countries approaching high-stakes elections. 2. AU mediation teams. The AU should empower its panel of the Wise and Democracy and Electoral Assistance Unit, DEAU, to engage Côte d'Ivoire before the situation escalates into a legitimacy crisis. 3. ECOWAS, accountability, benchmarks. As the regional economic bloc most affected by Ivorian stability, ECOWAS must enforce political accountability, not just economic coordination. Ivory Coast's role as a founding member places it under special obligation to exemplify democratic principles. 4. Pan-African civil society networks. Civil society must go beyond national borders and form coalitions of democratic vigilance to pressure leaders, educate voters, and support reform. African democracy will not survive unless Africans, across borders, demand and defend it collectively. Lessons for the diaspora: reclaiming the right to belong. Thiam's case also touches on a deeper question that resonates across the African diaspora. What does it mean to be African in the 21st century? His disqualification for acquiring foreign nationality decades ago, despite being a direct descendant of Côte d'Ivoire's founding president, underscores the precariousness of political reintegration for returnees. Many skilled African professionals, born or raised abroad, remain cautious about returning home, not because they do not wish to serve, but because their legitimacy is constantly questioned. Rather than welcoming their return as a brain gain, political systems often view them as threats to entrenched elites. If Africa is serious about reversing brain drain and building globally competitive leadership, governments must rethink citizenship laws, remove barriers to dual nationality, and eliminate restrictions that penalize diaspora identity. Countries like Rwanda, Ghana, and Senegal have shown that integrating diaspora expertise into public service enriches, not undermines, national governance. Thiam's exclusion could become a catalyst for broader reform if it sparks a continent-wide debate on inclusion, citizenship, and the future of African leadership. Reflections on the democratic moment. Ivory Coast at the crossroads. Ivory Coast now stands at a pivotal intersection of history. It can either reclaim its post-conflict democratic promise or reinforce the perception that elections are contests rigged by incumbents in legal robes. The country has the institutions, resources, and public goodwill to chart a bold democratic course, but only if its leaders choose courage over convenience. A successful resolution to the Thiam saga, one that includes legal clarity, political compromise, and public transparency, could reposition Ivory Coast not as a cautionary tale, but as a regional model of democratic maturity. Failure to do so will only embolden anti-democratic forces and deepen public cynicism. The continent is watching. So is the world. Key takeaways: lessons from Côte d'Ivoire's political crossroads. As Côte d'Ivoire navigates this critical electoral moment, The case of Tidjane Thiam's disqualification offers a series of urgent, instructive takeaways, not just for Ivorians, but for African societies broadly striving for democratic credibility, institutional resilience, and citizen trust. The following themes emerge clearly from this unfolding crisis. 1. Legalism without justice undermines democracy. The rule of law is not inherently democratic if laws are selectively enforced or wielded to disqualify political challengers. The Thiam case illustrates how formal legality can be misused to mask political intent, reviving the ghost of Ivoirité through procedural means. Laws should serve democratic ends, not stifle them. 2. Inclusive politics is non-negotiable in diverse societies. In a country as ethnically and regionally diverse as Côte d'Ivoire, excluding candidates with diaspora backgrounds or alternative trajectories from political participation not only weakens electoral competitiveness, but also alienates significant segments of the population. Inclusivity across region, ethnicity, and identity is not optional. It is essential for long-term national cohesion. 3. Youth expectations are rising. The demographic tide of youth across Africa demands more than performative democracy. They seek authenticity, opportunity, and representation. The exclusion of a modern reformist figure like Thiam is interpreted by many young Ivorians as evidence that the political system remains closed, unresponsive, and increasingly irrelevant to their aspirations. 4. The role of political legacy is evolving. Thiam's rejection by the system, despite being part of a storied political lineage, reveals how post-independence legacies no longer guarantee access or immunity. Today, legitimacy is being redefined not by birthright or historical association, but by capacity, credibility, and perceived fairness. 5. Credible elections require competitive fields. Elections without viable opposition are elections in name only. Excluding the main opposition candidates distorts electoral outcomes and can breed long-term instability. Côte d'Ivoire is again facing a scenario reminiscent of 2020, when boycotts, violence, and contested legitimacy tarnished the democratic process. 6. Political maturity lies in the willingness to step aside. As President Ouattara approaches the twilight of his political career, the decision he takes, whether to support a genuinely open electoral field or to preside over a stage-managed transition, will define his democratic legacy. Statesmanship today requires building bridges, not barricades. Long-term scenarios, 3 possible paths. After October 2025. What might Côte d'Ivoire look like after the 2025 presidential elections? While much depends on developments in the coming months, 3 general scenarios can be anticipated. Scenario A, reform and inclusion. A negotiated political settlement allows Thiam and other excluded figures to participate, restoring faith in the process. The elections are competitive, voter turnout is high, and the result, whoever wins, is widely accepted. This scenario stabilizes Côte d'Ivoire politically and boosts its economic profile across the region and globally. Prospects, higher international investor confidence, improved ECOWAS standing, and a revitalized civic space. Scenario B, status quo and suppression. The ruling party pushes ahead with the current field of candidates, resulting in a one-sided race. The outcome is marred by low turnout, domestic unrest, and international skepticism. While immediate violence is avoided, long-term legitimacy suffers and political tension festers beneath the surface. Prospects: short-term calm, but higher risk of civil resistance, youth radicalization, and international reputational damage. Scenario C, escalation and breakdown. Popular frustration erupts into sustained civil disobedience or street protests. Opposition parties boycott the vote, and post-election violence erupts. rekindling memories of the 2010-2011 crisis. The government imposes emergency measures, and international mediation becomes necessary. Prospects, economic downturn, institutional paralysis, and regression in regional influence toward 2030, Côte d'Ivoire and the future of African democracy. Looking ahead, Côte d'Ivoire's 2025 election will serve as a defining case study for Africa's democratic evolution in this decade. It sits at the intersection of many critical questions facing the continent. Can democracy thrive under constitutional constraints that are selectively interpreted? How do nations transition leadership in post-conflict societies without reigniting division? Will the African youth remain engaged in politics if systems continue to marginalize reformist voices? Can economic progress shield a country from democratic decline? Or will democratic legitimacy remain the foundation of lasting development? These are not just Ivorian questions. They are Pan-African dilemmas, playing out in diverse forms across Guinea, Cameroon, Congo-Brazzaville, and elsewhere. The decisions taken in Abidjan will resonate far beyond its borders. If Côte d'Ivoire rises to this challenge with openness, courage, and reform, it will reaffirm its role as a regional beacon of recovery, resilience, and renewal. If not, it risks becoming yet another cautionary tale of potential squandered and democracy deferred. Regaining the narrative, strategic communication for the Thiam campaign. In the current climate, where legal battles and court rulings have overshadowed political debate, Tidjane Thiam's camp faces a decisive challenge: how to transform a legal exclusion into a moral and political rallying cry. While the judiciary may have ruled on technical eligibility, the court of public opinion remains active and highly influential. Thiam's team must now implement a multi-tiered communication strategy to ensure that the narrative does not remain defined by disqualification, but rather by resilience, reform, and resistance to exclusion. This requires a deliberate shift in messaging, audience targeting, and media deployment. 1. Position Thiam as the victim of an outdated system, not an illegal actor. The messaging should avoid direct confrontation with the judiciary, focusing instead on the systemic absurdity of the law and the missed opportunity for Ivorian democracy. This includes statements such as, "We respect the law, but we must modernize it to reflect who we are today, a country of diaspora, innovation, and youth." This ruling does not just affect me, it disenfranchises millions of Ivorian voices who want change. This frame transforms Thiam into a symbol of institutional reform rather than personal grievance. 2. Appeal to the diaspora as a political constituency. Côte d'Ivoire's diaspora population, spread across France, the United States, Canada, the UK, and West Africa, represents not just remittances, but intellectual capital, international influence, and digital outreach. Thiam's exclusion should be turned into a platform for diaspora inclusion reform, with strategic messaging along the lines of, "We cannot exclude those who left because of crisis, but want to return to rebuild." Ivory Coast must become a nation that welcomes its children back, not punishes them for leaving. Virtual town halls, diaspora coalition endorsements, and op-eds in international media, e.g., a Le Monde, The Guardian, New York Times, would help position Thiam as a Pan-African transnational leader, not just a local candidate. 3. Leverage digital media and youth creators. With over 60% smartphone penetration and an increasingly active youth presence on Facebook, TikTok, WhatsApp, and X, Twitter, the digital arena is where political perceptions are being formed. Thiam's team must collaborate with influencers, content creators, comedians, and spoken word artists to communicate key messages in relatable formats, short animations, or skits satirizing the dual nationality ruling. music videos, or freestyle rap versus linking exclusion to broader youth marginalization. Campaign hashtags such as Let Ivorians Choose, No to Exclusion, or Reform for All. This approach could stimulate viral political engagement while avoiding overt partisanship or incitement. 4. Maintain a presence without breaking the law. Although legally barred from contesting as a candidate, Thiam can remain politically active through civic engagement, policy proposals, media commentary, and coalition building. By launching a Côte d'Ivoire 2030 vision platform, he can release a policy blueprint on youth employment, education, digital infrastructure, and judicial reform, host a national listening tour in regions where political disenchantment is strongest, engage traditional leaders and women's cooperatives to broaden support beyond urban elites. This strategy keeps him in the political spotlight while reinforcing his identity as a builder of systems, not a breaker of laws. Comparative case studies. From exclusion to reintegration in African politics, Tidjane Thiam is not the first African political actor to be legally excluded from elections, nor would he be the first to make a comeback. Across the continent, there are notable precedents of reintegration following exclusion, each offering valuable lessons for both opposition actors and ruling elites. 1. Nelson Chamisa, Zimbabwe, navigating structural barriers. Though never legally disqualified, Chamisa's Citizens Coalition for Change, CCC, has faced a combination of court rulings, police suppression, and biased electoral commission decisions. Despite these obstacles, Chamisa has maintained his influence by mobilizing youth, leveraging digital platforms, and positioning himself as the future rather than the victim. Thiam can adopt a similar tone, hopeful, strategic, and forward-looking, while focusing on the next democratic window if 2025 remains shut. 2. Laurent Gbagbo, Côte d'Ivoire, from prison to political return. Ironically, former President Laurent Gbagbo, now barred from contesting, was once excluded under controversial conditions, but later restored through negotiations and popular pressure. His reintegration after ICC acquittal in 2021 shows how shifting political climates and public opinion can reopen doors. It also illustrates that exclusion rarely silences political figures permanently in volatile political environments. 3. Hakainde Hichilema, Zambia, defying repression with persistence. Before becoming Zambia's president in 2021, Hichilema was arrested 15 times, accused of treason, and barred from accessing public media. Yet he persisted, focused on issue-based politics, and waited for the ruling party to exhaust its legitimacy. When the opportunity came, he was ready. Thiam, likewise, must view this moment not as an end, but as a strategic intermission. 4. Bassirou Diomaye Faye, Senegal, from prison to presidency. Perhaps the most recent and dramatic turnaround is Senegal's 2024 election, where opposition leader Diomaye Faye, imprisoned just weeks before the vote, went on to win the presidency after last-minute political negotiations allowed his release and candidacy. This stunning reversal proves that even under dire constraints, popular will and democratic momentum can prevail if institutional mechanisms and civil society pressure align. Electoral reform as the cornerstone of democratic renewal. In Côte d'Ivoire, if the Thiam exclusion controversy is to become a transformative moment rather than a tragic footnote in Ivorian political history, then the path forward must include deep, systemic electoral reforms. These reforms must be aimed at closing the loopholes that enable exclusion, reinforcing institutional independence, and restoring public confidence in democracy as the legitimate route to power. Côte d'Ivoire's electoral framework has come under intense scrutiny, not because it lacks laws, but because those laws are often vague, selectively applied, and vulnerable to political manipulation. The time has come to overhaul this system, not only to accommodate current political actors, but to future-proof Ivorian democracy itself. 1. Clarify and modernize the nationality clause. At the heart of the Thiam saga lies an outdated 1961 nationality law that fails to reflect the realities of modern mobility, dual identity, and diaspora engagement. Many African nations, such as Rwanda, Ghana, and Cape Verde, have moved to fully recognize dual citizenship, understanding that today's African is just as likely to have studied or worked abroad as at home. Côte d'Ivoire must urgently remove or revise the automatic citizenship loss provision linked to acquiring foreign nationality. Define clear, fair, and timely procedures for citizenship restoration and candidate eligibility. Codify exceptions for dual nationals who acquired foreign nationality by descent or parental lineage. This reform is essential not only to avoid future disqualifications, but also to attract talented diaspora professionals into national service. 2. Establish a transparent and accountable candidate vetting process. The current opacity surrounding candidate validation enables selective exclusion. The process must be redesigned to include independent review panels with representation from all major political parties and civil society. Clear timelines for objection, appeal, and resolution of eligibility disputes, well ahead of electoral deadlines. Publication of all rulings and supporting documentation to ensure public scrutiny and transparency. Such a process will help remove the perception that electoral exclusion is a tool of incumbency and restore faith in the rule of law as impartial. 3. Strengthen the independence and capacity of the Electoral Commission, CEI. While Côte d'Ivoire's Independent Electoral Commission exists in name, its perceived partiality remains a major source of mistrust, especially among opposition parties. A truly autonomous electoral body must be reconstituted with equal representation from the ruling party, opposition parties, and nonpartisan civil society. Possess a protected, non-renewable mandate for its leadership to avoid executive interference. Be empowered to sanction misconduct, correct irregularities, and investigate allegations of manipulation. Donor institutions and regional bodies like ECOWAS and the African Union could provide technical support and capacity building to modernize electoral operations, including digitizing the voter registry and introducing transparent result transmission mechanisms. 4. Introduce judicial oversight reforms. A fair electoral process cannot exist where the judiciary acts as an extension of the executive. Ivorian courts have faced growing skepticism over their political neutrality, especially in high-profile political cases. To restore confidence, the judiciary must undergo merit-based appointment reforms insulated from political influence, be subject to peer and public review of high-impact rulings through a judicial ethics council, facilitate the creation of a constitutional court or electoral dispute tribunal solely dedicated to resolving pre- and post-election disputes transparently and swiftly. Only with visible and verifiable independence can the judiciary act as a neutral arbiter of political contestation. 5. Constitutional term limit enforcement and leadership succession law. Côte d'Ivoire has faced recurring crises over presidential succession, first with the Ivoirité exclusion of Ouattara, then the controversial third term in 2020, and now a potential fourth term looming in 2025. Without clear boundaries, these disputes will repeat. The Constitution must be amended to reaffirm and enforce strict two-term presidential limits with no ambiguity or exceptions, require that any constitutional amendment affecting presidential terms cannot apply retroactively, set mechanisms for orderly political succession within parties, including internal primaries and leadership term limits. These provisions can reduce political personalization of power, foster generational renewal, and minimize the crisis of legitimacy. Civic education and voter empowerment, rebuilding the democratic culture. Even the most robust legal and institutional reforms will fall short unless accompanied by civic reawakening. Côte d'Ivoire's democratic resilience depends on the ability of citizens, especially youth, women, and rural voters, to understand their rights, demand accountability, and reject authoritarian tendencies in all forms. A nationwide civic education campaign should focus on voter rights, the role of institutions, and the dangers of political exclusion, promote peaceful participation, media literacy, and legal recourse options for grievances, be implemented through schools, religious centers, local radio stations, and digital platforms in partnership with the UNDP, Open Society Foundations, and local NGOs. Such efforts could lay the groundwork for a participatory political culture rooted in values, not personalities. Côte d'Ivoire 2030, a vision of democratic consolidation. Imagine a Côte d'Ivoire in the year 2030. The nation has just concluded another peaceful presidential election. The campaign was vibrant, competitive, and issue-based. Voter turnout reached a record 78%, driven by active participation from first-time voters under 30. International observers from ECOWAS, the African Union, and the Carter Center hailed the election as free, fair, and reflective of the will of the people. The losing candidate conceded graciously. The streets of Abidjan were filled not with protest, but with celebration of democracy itself. This vision became reality not through chance, but through the hard work of reform, inclusion, and institutional renewal. The outdated nationality clause was replaced with modern dual citizenship provisions. The Independent Electoral Commission was restructured, its members appointed through a transparent parliamentary process. A new electoral disputes tribunal adjudicated pre-election complaints swiftly and publicly. Most critically, the presidency passed from one leader to another without drama, bloodshed, or accusations of foul play. This is not utopia. This is the natural destination of a political system that chooses accountability over autocracy, rules over rulers, and citizens over strongmen. Final reflections. Advice to African leaders. The unfolding events in Côte d'Ivoire, and indeed across the continent, should be a wake-up call to Africa's political class. The continent's median age is 19.7. Its future belongs to young people who no longer accept democratic mimicry or elite impunity. To African leaders, we offer the following counsel. 1. Do not fear competition, fear its absence. A truly popular leader does not require the disqualification of opponents to win. Robust opposition sharpens policy, increases legitimacy, and proves a leader's mandate is real. 2. Leave office. When the Constitution says so, power is not meant to be hoarded indefinitely. Respecting term limits is not weakness. It is wisdom. Legacy is built through succession, not perpetual incumbency. 3. Invite the diaspora to build, not just to remit. The African diaspora is not a threat. It is a treasure trove of experience, innovation, and patriotism. Integrate them, welcome them, empower them. 4. Invest in institutions, not just infrastructure. Roads and bridges are important, but without trusted courts, fair elections, and independent parliaments, democracy collapses under its own weight. Build systems that last longer than personalities. 5. Engage youth before they disengage. You listen to them, include them, let them lead. If ignored, they will find other ways to speak, through protest, migration, or resistance. Summary of key messages. Tidjane Thiam's disqualification reveals deep flaws in Côte d'Ivoire's electoral and nationality laws, with implications for broader democratic credibility. Electoral exclusion is becoming a growing trend in Africa, where legal technicalities are being used to undermine genuine democratic competition. Youth disillusionment is a ticking time bomb. Disengaged citizens are more likely to embrace populism, military interventions, or political apathy. Institutional reforms, from clarifying nationality laws to restructuring electoral commissions, are essential to restore public trust. African precedents show that exclusion is not the end of political careers. Leaders from Senegal to Zambia have rebounded through persistence and popular support. Civil society and the diaspora must play a central role in defending democratic norms and holding leaders accountable. African leaders must choose legacy over longevity and embrace competitive, transparent systems that put the people, not incumbents, at the center of politics. As the world watches Côte d'Ivoire, let this moment serve not only as a national crisis, but also as a continental lesson. Democracy, like cocoa, grows best in fertile soil of justice, inclusion, and equal opportunity. Let us nurture that soil across Africa and ensure that future generations inherit not only thriving economies, but also thriving democracies. Thank you for watching The Bold African Voice, BAV. If you found value in this analysis, like, comment, and share to spark the conversation. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode where we dig deep, challenge power, and stand up for African democracy. Until next time, stay bold, stay informed, and stay African.